I'm Luke Hagery. I'm the viticulturist at the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program, which is part of Cornell University. We received a grant from the New York Farm Viability Institute to look at cover crops and Concord vineyards.
My name's Kevin Martin. We're pretty excited here today to talk about some cover crop work that he's been doing the last couple of years. I think it's pretty new for perennial crops and grapes, so hopefully we see some changes in the industry because of it.
So we did a 2-year cover crop study where we teamed up with area grape growers and looked at what they were planting. We tried a few different mixes. We had a few of the growers trying up to 8 different species in a single cover crop mix, and another grower that tried like 8 different series of mixes. So it was a good time to kind of get out and take a look at what was going on. And then we evaluated pruning weight, soil structure and soil nutrients and things like that. Also vine health things with the petiole. But we also looked at weeds and which cover crops are suppressing weeds and yield, and just kind of did a whole shotgun approach to try to figure out as much as we could in that 2-year time period. We got a lot of exciting data when it comes to vine size, their pruning weights, and a lot of our weed data.
I know a little bit about cover crops, and it seems like you can do a lot of different things, and the choices of seed mixes can be very complicated. But in a period of 2 years, what was the biggest takeaway? Was there anything that happened that was dramatic?
I think the biggest takeaway, or I guess my number one recommendation, would be annual ryegrass and tillable radish mix. Those 2 mixes are pretty common, but those 2 mixes with clover added in there to help build your nitrogen base was also a positive thing. But when you looked at the data, a lot of positive things happened when you had annual ryegrass and tillable radish. And for rates for that, the rate of annual ryegrass was around 15 pounds an acre, and the radish was about a pound an acre. When we planted more than a pound an acre, we started to kind of shadow out a lot of that ryegrass that we planted, so we lost some of the benefits there. So around a pound of radish seemed to be sufficient.
Was there an impact on vine size?
In a good way and a bad way. So it really, this project really showed that there's a lot of potential here, but there's also some risk here. So knowing what you're planting and more or less when to terminate is important. And what I mean is we looked at gravelly sites, heavy clay, and loamy soils. And all of those sites where we had classified with NDVI, like where smaller vines are at and medium vines, so kind of on the lower end of the producing scale, where they had cover crops, the vine size jumped dramatically, which is great. I mean, we've been trying to figure out how to get our small vines bigger for a long time. And in 2 years, we're able to increase anywhere from 10 or 15% all the way up to 30% of those small vines in size in just a short amount of time, which is great. However, the bigger vines, I think some of the competition that's involved with planting a cover crop, those bigger vines, they saw in some cases, especially on the gravel and loamy sites, where you had big vines, the cover crop competed with them, and you could see a dip where they actually decreased in vine size. When you looked at everything together, there was still an overall increase in overall vine size, but that came from the small vines and big vines. There's such a dramatic uptick from those and a small, downtick from the other thing. And I think really that has to do with when we're terminating. So growing cover crops in Concord grapes, we really have, the sky's the limit for planting. We can plant it any time, we can terminate it any time. So we have a large window, and I think we kind of found through this study that really looking at when to terminate or kill the cover crop is very important.
Yeah, I mean, my big takeaway from looking at what you've presented is really being careful about termination on gravel soils. And I think maybe those effects were exaggerated because, to provide some context, it's very early 2017 now. So this happened in 2016, and we had a very severe drought in 2016 of really historic proportions in our area. So maybe that effect was exaggerated, but regardless, it's going to be severe, and it's a risk that I think growers should probably avoid, even though that drought was so dramatic. Any kind of water stress is going to cost a lot of money. To me, it seems like the big takeaway is ryegrass and radish worked very well.
For vine size, and I did mention.
For vine size?
And for weed suppression, where we had radish and annual ryegrass, we had the best weed suppression, especially when we were looking at myristil. And myristil has been a big problem for grape growers to kind of control across the belt. And that combination really seemed to suppress, I mean, almost fully suppressed. It didn't show up in our weed counts, but when you'd stand back and look at a row, you'd see a couple here and there. And then where you didn't have cover crop or a different cover crop mix was planted, where you didn't have that combination, you saw mare's tail in there. So that was a big, for weed suppression, that combination worked very well.
So I think we have a really nice introductory combination for some immediate impact, which actually surprised me. And the only other major takeaway is just termination and being careful with termination, because it can result in some negative effects as well.
My recommendation right now is that if you're growing on a gravel site or you have large vines, so we don't have that competition with the cover crop, that the cover crop should be terminated when the shoot length is around 6 inches. So I would say that 3 to 6 inch stage, depending on how the weather outlook looks, I would be gearing up to terminate around that time. In the past, we've been going more that later May, where the shoot length's probably 8 to 10 or almost bloom. I think waiting that long is where we've seen that impact of that competition. So being able to eliminate, and I think at the 6 inch stage shoot, our cover crop we're still getting a lot of growth out of it. I mean, the ryegrass is, almost knee high, and a lot of the clover is really going at that time. So I still think we're getting a big bang for our buck at that time. And anything past that might just be a little too risky to go with. On the heavy ground, you could probably delay that to later May or 8 or 10, because we found that didn't have an impact even on the drier, on the heavier clay soils, that you had more leeway, and the longer you let them go, we still saw an increase in production.
I just want to highlight that because I think that's new viticulture for a lot of our growers. Ever since Bob Poole, really, row middle termination advisement has been at bloom. And you're pushing it back much closer to bud break, around 6 inches of shoot growth. So that's very different, and doesn't just apply to cover crops, but it is kind of a different direction than many of our growers have heard in the past. So
Yeah.
I just want to remind growers that is new information.
Talking to Kevin about some of the economics behind cover crop data that we've gathered over the past 2 years. As part of the project that looking at cover crops, we looked at yield and we looked at vine size and that correlation with cover crops, and we started to find some pretty interesting things. So Kevin's been taking a look at that. Kevin, do you want to kind of maybe start a little bit about what we're finding?
Absolutely. So when we first started looking at this project, the one thing we were really focused on were seed costs and application costs, and trying to justify why a grower would do cover crop, as many growers in our area don't utilize cover crop for their row middle management. And I think we can talk a little bit more about that. It is kind of a complicated question because there are so many seed mixes, but really I think the focus is just on having cover crops versus not having cover crops, because what we found is some pretty dramatic effects, and those effects happened with some relatively inexpensive seed mixes, sort of shifting our focus away from what seed costs and towards how we manage cover crops. So for example, we saw a relatively dramatic increase in some of the heavy clay sites when we use cover crops versus not using cover crops. And what that really translates to from an economic perspective is at least a $225 increase in gross revenue per acre. That investment was around $40 to $50 per acre to get that $225 increase. We want to look at this for a few more years if we can to see if that $225 increase is a one-time increase or if it's more of a permanent benefit as a result of increasing the soil health. We know at least, though, that we saw that increase in the sort of in between the third and fourth year of cover crops on that heavy clay soil. So that was really impressive and probably more dramatic than what I expected.
And just to kind of get into a little more of the background on there, with the heavy clay, we saw where there wasn't cover crop, we had half-pound vines, and where there was cover crop, we were almost 1.25 pounds. However, when we moved to the gravelly sites, I think we saw there was a little more risk there. Where we had cover crop, especially big vines and cover crops, that where we had cover crops on big vines on gravel sites, we saw a decrease in vine size. So there is risks there, and maybe you can talk about some of the risks with cover crops and how we can navigate around them.
In some way, I think we can almost talk about one of our failures in terms of cover crop management. And I think that's the point of research, is we try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. And a late termination or no termination on gravel in a dry year has some really dramatic effects. And to some of our growers, that may be stating the obvious, but those effects were actually very dramatic. So we're looking at a 2.5 pound vine nearly on a gravel site in terms of what our average was, and we were reducing that to a 1 pound vine. So we're going from a relatively healthy, decent performing vineyard to something that's really struggling and needs rehab in the course of a single year. So we're looking at a decrease in yield of about $200 per acre related to that water stress, and most of that presented itself in berry size. And in addition to that, since it did present itself in berry size, that stress was already there. So you're looking at probably at least another $350 in potential crop loss
on those sites. So I think looking at an earlier termination is really a key or really important thing to kind of look at going into the future.
Yeah, I really think that there's a potential for gravel sites to benefit as much as heavy clay or more. We think of a gravel site as better for vineyards, and for the most part it often is. But the benefits that cover crops offer may disproportionately benefit those gravel sites, but only if you manage it correctly. And
Right.
it looks to be a lot more finicky. So just be careful with your termination dates.
Yes.
And how they bump up their vine size instead of decreasing it, because that's really where the rubber meets the road when it comes to economics.
So from this research project, I think we were able to develop quite a few recommendations on the do's and don'ts of planting cover crops in Concord vineyards. With that, I'd like to thank the New York Farm Viability Institute for funding this work, and I'd like to thank the participating grape growers that were involved. So they're the really driving force of this project.